Hey, it's Mike here, and today, monk fruit. It is the newest natural 0-calorie sweetener. I'm seeing on the shelves a lot. I'm seeing it everywhere, and so I have to ask, what is it? Is it healthy? We're gonna dive into the research on various health effects, ranging from blood sugar response to teeth and gut and beyond. And all of this is gonna be put into the context of general 0-calorie sweeteners, because there are a lot of concerns that have been raised about those. For example, from this paper, that they could create, quote, a vicious cycle of pancreatic endocrine dysfunction. That sounds scary. Does that apply to monk fruit? We'll see. But actually, I need to be transparent here because this is new. We're lacking quite a bit of research. However, we do have multiple randomized controlled trials on humans and some other sort of petri dish tests that could at least hint at some things that are good or bad. It's also being marketed as an antioxidant, so we'll look a little bit into that. But this video is gonna contrast to my actual sugar ranking video that looked at real different types of sugar and was the inspiration for looking into this at all. That is different. Sugar's calories. This does not have calories, and I will link that video below if you're interested in sugar ranking. And finally, I have never actually had this stuff to my knowledge, so I have a little bit of a taste test that I'm gonna be doing here. Got myself a little dime bag of monk fruit. Monk fruit is relatively new on the scene, but it has exploded into the mainstream. I mean, heck, you can even buy Splenda with some monk fruit in it. And I really wanted to look into this to answer the question, could this be something that's added to a more whole food vegan diet so that people might be less tempted to go and just randomly drink a Coca-Cola and fall off the wagon? Because if that's the case, it could be used to keep people eating a healthy dietary pattern, but of course it needs to be investigated. But first, let's look at the background of this fruit, which is frankly quite interesting because it's not in a typical fruit family that you eat like a potato. It's not a fruit. Again, unlike the artificial sweeteners, this is a natural sweetener, so it comes from a plant, much like stevia does. And in this case, it actually comes from a cucurbit family plant. So it's the gourd family, and it looks like a cucumber plant, basically, where this little ball is growing instead of a cucumber. Here's the Latin name, which I will not attempt to pronounce, but it's just funny that despite this being an ancient Chinese medicine, it got named after the random European dude who came and discovered it. And in Chinese medicine, it is known as Luo Han Guo. And I will say, Chinese medicine, I mean, they're for like pangolin scales for male performance. No science behind that, so we have to investigate whether or not there is science going on here, as usual. But beyond that, there's a very interesting sort of political situation going on with this fruit in that it grows traditionally in a very specific part of China, and the Chinese government has gone as far as to make a law in 2004 that bans the rest of the world from growing it? Talk about forbidden fruit from the Forbidden City. Oh, anyway, I should just stop with that, but move on to how somehow they let Procter & Gamble actually develop a process to extract the sweetener from the fruit, because they were saying there were conflicting flavors in there that basically probably made it gross. And they did a taste test of the actual fruit on the YouTube channel Tasted, and here was their response.
It's so sweet.
That is weird.
It's very sweet, but it tastes like it's rotten.
So sweet and rotten, you know, could be a good pop song name. Not the best fruit angle in terms of taste, but they created the process to get rid of that in 1995. That was then approved by the FDA, generally recognized as safe, just in 2013. So this is all quite recent. And it is interesting that the fruit tastes so different than the refined sweetener, because when I took a bite of a stevia leaf, I was like, holy crap, this tastes exactly the same as stevia powder. Anyway, through the refining process, they're adding some sulfur-based compounds, and they end up with the sweetener, which is known as mogroside 5. Sounds nice and healthy. Not to be confused with mogwaside when you kill a gremlin, aka Mogwai from the movie Gremlins. And as this paper mentions, mogroside 5 is 250 times sweeter than sugar, but I do feel like taste buds don't really work that linearly. It probably just registers as really sweet, and that seems to be where a lot of the main artificial sweeteners land, around 300. Some of them, which are crazy, go all the way up to like 10,000 or 20,000 times. I don't know what that tastes like. And in terms of the actual mechanism here, a lot of these artificial sweeteners land on your same sweetness taste buds, those receptors, but then they can actually lodge into them a slightly different way. And it probably isn't the cause for it, but it just feels like to me that these sweeteners are a little bit hollow tasting, and I wonder if that's the receptor or a body detecting no calories. I don't know. And with that in mind, let's do a little taste test. All right, so I'm just on my phone camera here the next day because that little pouch taste test was a total fail. I thought it tasted kind of like vanilla. Turns out it even had natural flavors. It had like 4 ingredients. It was not a good representation. I was just walking through Walmart last night though, unfortunately, and I walked by this, which is erythritol and monk fruit extract, which is a better representation. So I'm just going to try some right here, right now. Maybe it's the large grains, but it seems a lot more convincingly like sugar. It's giving me a little bit of a sort of xylitol mouthfeel, if you're familiar with that. I'm not getting that vanilla flavor, not getting that hollow kind of stevia flavor, so I would say this is better. Maybe it's mainly just erythritol though, so I don't have a comparison. Anyway, that's my taste test. All right, now let's get on to the health effects, and there is definitely a lack of human data in a lot of areas here, especially in the area of it being an antioxidant. How effective is it in humans? We don't know. However, they have done studies, of course, on animals, like oxidative stress in mice cells helps, neuron damage in mice also helps, and pig lung tissue appears to be beneficial there. Literally saying that the results indicate that mogroside 5 can alleviate the inflammatory response of pig alveolar macrophages induced by air pollutants of PM 2.5. They're actually talking about the horrible air within factory farms potentially being mitigated by using this mogroside 5, which is just pretty crazy, the crap that they have to do. Anyway, obviously I hate factory farming and I really don't like animal studies either, but it appears to have some mechanistic antioxidant ability. Will it actually work in humans? We have no idea. How does it compare to other sweeteners or sugars, for example? We don't know. But this brings me to the 2 very interesting randomized control trials that included monk fruit and other sweeteners that were sugar-free, as well as some sugar water. Interesting stuff. And Dr. Greger covered these on nutritionfacts.org, and he honestly kind of freaked me out a little bit, being like, oh, these aren't really helping with blood sugar, as he says here.
Drink that bottle of sugar water with its 20 sugar cubes worth of sugar, and your blood sugars jump 40 points over the next hour. Whereas you give an aspartame sweetened beverage, or monk fruit, or stevia, and nothing happens, which is what you'd expect, right? I mean, these are non-caloric sweeteners, no calories. At the 1-hour mark, they fed people a regular lunch. And so the blood sugars went back up and down as they normally would after a meal. But that was in the group that drank the sugar an hour before. In the group that drank the aspartame, even though their blood sugars didn't rise at the time, an hour later at lunch, they shot up higher as if the person had just drank a bottle of soda. Okay, but what about the natural sweetener stevia and monk fruit? Same thing. And then they measured blood sugars over 24 hours. And there was no significant difference found between any of them.
Anyway, saying that despite not getting a spike when you're actually drinking it, and right after that, it might encourage you to eat more at your next meal, and then it leads to this big spike there. And that concerned me a lot, but it left me with a lot of questions, and I had to look closer at the study. The first questions I had were how much sugar was actually being drank in that sugar water before the meal. I also was wondering, like, how much more did they actually eat during the meal in the monk fruit group, as well as the other 0-calorie sweetener groups. Turns out that sugar water was no joke. We're talking about 65 grams of sucrose, table sugar, which translates to about 260 calories, which is, quite a bit for a little drink there. And then during lunch, it turns out that there was really not that much of a difference in terms of what was consumed. We're talking about only between 50 and 80 calories more than that sugar drink group. But that blood sugar spike was significantly larger. And in case you're wondering, this meal was fried rice, and they generally ate around 800 calories, but again, that varied. A 10% increase in calorie consumption should not equate to a doubling of the blood sugar spike, and it seems like this could only be caused by 2 things. Maybe you can think of another one, but one is that it's doing some type of metabolic signaling that is leading to a more dramatic response. And we will investigate that in detail in a little bit, but there's also another possibility which has to do with the timing here. If you have seen a typical blood sugar chart where people are drinking straight sugar, it goes up and then it crashes. You go below the baseline, and that is right about where they decided to give people lunch. So while this is a good study designed to figure out how much people might eat after having some 0-calorie sweeteners versus sugar, but I think it's a horrible design if you're trying to parse out whether or not there is some type of strange insulin signaling that's going on that's going to be affecting your next meal. So what could be happening is, instead of going into the negative there, that gap could actually just be applied to the peak of the meal. And the drift I got from Dr. Greger's video was that with these sweeteners like monk fruit, you're just sort of borrowing glucose from Peter to pay Paul, in the sense that it's all gonna even out anyway. But I don't really buy this for a few reasons, and that brings me to the 24-hour study. Because in the 24-hour study, yeah, they said it's the same over a whole day, but they only gave them one sucrose drink, one sugary drink, which could easily be diffused out throughout the whole day. And they even mentioned that if they were to perhaps give them 3 sucrose drinks a day, then they could have seen a different result. And just looking to that chart, imagine seeing 2 more high pumps up of glucose. I really think that a sugary drink would be different here in somebody who's consuming multiple drinks per day. And in this 24-hour randomized control trial, it's worth mentioning that once again, there isn't a dramatic difference in the amount of calories that were eaten in the next meal after that drink. It was only like 55 to 70 calories less in the sugar drink. I think if this spike is breakfast and then lunch is a bigger meal, I think a normal sized lunch spike would be bigger than breakfast, but it's not in the sugar group. And another concern that could have been raised by watching Greger's video was that having these non-calorie sweeteners was actually going to be supercharging your appetite to make you A, perhaps crave more sweets later, or B, just be eating way more calories later. But the study itself shoots down that concern. They cite a couple studies, the first of which was one where weight loss actually did occur with the 0-calorie sweeteners, and then another one talking about how they likely actually reduce sweetness cravings, but they're not creating some weird hyper sweet craving because you're now hooked on this super sugar, 200 times the normal flavor. And from the study itself, they say, quote, "When the results are taken together, the evidence seems to suggest that the use of non-nutritive sweeteners," their term for this, "does not lead to overconsumption." But I think what Greger's main point was that it's not leading to people eating way less calories. It's not leading to way lower blood glucose, according to that study. But I do think there is a pretty major flaw with both of those randomized control trials, and that's that they didn't even have a placebo that was essentially water. Because if we had the same blood sugar response after that meal or during that meal, then we'd know for pretty much sure, or with a high degree of certainty, that there wasn't any weird insulin signaling things that were boosting insulin responses afterwards. But that does bring me to the whole metabolic time bomb concern. Are there chronic down the line issues that could be caused by these 0-calorie sweeteners? First of all, let's get a little bit into mechanism with that fear-mongering paper that I cited earlier, talking about the vicious cycle of pancreatic endocrine dysfunction. Well, the paper mentions the actual sort of pathway that is occurring here that could be concerning, and that is that when you normally eat sugar, you have just a cascade of effects. It activates sweet taste receptors on the tongue, and that signals the brain that calories are expected and initiates the cephalic phase response, which is a cascade of anticipatory hormone signals that increase insulin secretion, gastric enzyme production, and initiates satiety signaling. But they say that this is completely disrupted with these 0-calorie sweeteners because there are no calories. And in terms of the pancreas, they say this could be activating pancreatic beta cells, which produce insulin. And as you probably guessed, we don't have a long-term insulin-related study in terms of monk fruit. However, we do have one on chronic sucralose consumption, aka Splenda. This is a randomized control trial where they took healthy adults, young people, and they gave them either 48 grams of sucralose once a day or 96 grams of sucralose once a day over the course of 10 weeks, or placebo, and then they measured the insulin and glucose responses to a actual sugary drink later down the line, and the result was for the 40-ish gram one, they found there was an increase in insulin and glucose response. But here's the weird thing, gotta love science, the higher 90-gram dose didn't find any relationship. It was pretty much the same as placebo. They do not have an explanation for that, and I wish there were more data on some chronic exposure to this stuff. But at least in terms of this meta-analysis of randomized control trials, they say that no, these non-nutritive sweeteners were not found to elevate blood glucose level. But again, they don't seem to be looking at it really long term. Could it be sort of changing metabolism a little bit to be more hyperreactive? But it's also worth mentioning this little packet that I ate hardly any of is only 2 grams. So just sticking to this sort of amount is probably completely irrelevant in terms of the insulin concern. And I know it seems kind of scary. There might be like some effect on insulin, but it's also worth mentioning just the horrible effects of refined sugar, which most people are okay in consuming pretty decent amounts. I mean, we're talking about, of course, the oxidative stress, which would further heart disease, lesions, and things like that you really don't want, accelerates aging. Of course, it would also exacerbate diabetes, and finally, causes cavities. And that brings me to the theoretical tooth-related points about mogroside 5, and that is that it has a huge advantage in that its pH is neutral, and it's not going to be blooming a ton of tooth-related bacteria that would then create this acidic thing and dig through your enamel. No, it's superior to other zero-calorie sweeteners here, like aspartame can be between a pH of 3 and 5, which is of course more acidic. Stevia, the plant itself is a 9, but then of course we refine it down to a pH of a 5, but even then, that seems to be beneficial for teeth, but not as beneficial as xylitol, as many studies like this one have shown. And one of the key benefits of xylitol, beyond mineralization and increasing saliva flow, is that it has a higher, less acidic pH. So my money's on it being good for teeth, but I will say I was drinking some stevia sodas a while back, and they made my breath kind of bad, and I really wonder if the same thing would happen with some monk fruit sweetened soda. Somebody make some and send it to me. Perks of being a YouTuber. And then I'll forget to share it on my Instagram like I often do. I'm sorry, people. Anyway, moving on to the gut stuff. Now, just because something has 0 calories doesn't mean it has no effect on the gut. Could that effect be negative or positive? There have been concerns with other sweeteners. I don't want to go too much into those because we actually do have a study here. Unfortunately, it's an in vitro petri dish study, but it's still, simulating a human gut and giving us some answers that are better than none. They say that some incubation with mogroside 5 for a day, 24 hours, resulted in a change in diversity with actually more Bacteroides and Lactobacillus and Prevotella and some others which are good, and the inhibition of some other not as favorable bacteria. Perhaps more importantly, also the synthesis of short-chain fatty acids such as acetate, propionate, and butyrate, and those are good gut metabolites that are generally created from fiber, so that's a plus there. However, propionate is known for its appetite regulation, and it's pretty clear from the randomized control trials that there's not enough propionate being created to have a clinical effect on that, based off how much people ate and lunch afterwards. Close out from that study, they say that enhanced antioxidant abilities were found, as well as that potential prebiotic beneficial effect on the human gut. While that study didn't have industry funding, it is worth mentioning that it was supported by the Chinese government, which clearly, with a monopoly on monk fruit, would want to make it look as good as possible. Just, take that with a grain of salt. Or a grain of monk fruit stevia sweetener, which is literally all over my lap. So let's sum it up with the bigger picture here. I really don't want to stoke a ton of fear about this, but I also think a little bit of caution is necessary. This is a food that has only been in the US food supply for 9 years. Before that, virtually nobody was eating this stuff, especially before the mogroside 5 method of production was made, which was only like 15 or 17 years ago. That being said, immediate consumption appears to be completely safe. Long-term chronic consumption leading to some type of insulin issue, that would be the case with all of these sweeteners. It's a possibility, but then again, we have that conflicting data with having the higher dose doesn't create that effect. What? And then it's also just logically worth saying that a much lower dose, like our little packet here, is not going to be creating any major issues. Anyway, it's also worth just revisiting those 2 randomized control trials, which I think were just extremely flawed for getting the answers that we wanted here. Yes, it's worth mentioning that there doesn't appear to be some amazing blood sugar lowering effect of having these non-sugar sweeteners, but the way they timed a meal exactly where a sugar crash would be just makes it a little bit sketchy to me. So this video offers absolutely no certainty. Well, the little bit of certainty you can get is that refined white standard sugar is horrible. You can watch my video on how the other sugars add up in terms of antioxidant effect and so on. But again, we're talking about sugar directly contributing to oxidative stress and disease, and we know it spikes blood sugar dramatically. So obviously it's better to get that out of your diet, and I personally believe that if having a little bit of monk fruit is gonna keep you eating a more whole food based diet, then clearly it's gonna be benefiting you more than it's gonna be harming you. Not medical advice. All right, let me know down below what you think about monk fruit. Do you like the taste? Are you somebody who has been keeping track of their blood sugar and experimented with it? I would love to know what you think about any of these insulin concerns. And that's it. Feel free to like the video because it helps out in terms of the algorithm and people discovering this channel. I feel like a like on a video probably equates to an extra view in terms of how much the algorithm likes it. So, you know, if you want to do that, go ahead. You can also subscribe, all that good stuff, and thanks for watching.